Hi all, and welcome back to day 3. This is going to be the last lecture that you receive pre-recorded from me. Tomorrow you're actually going to be watching a few videos that are directly from some of the individuals that are doing research in biosocial criminology. So I hope you enjoy those. Well, you have more likely than not heard the saying that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, and the implication being that they are fundamentally and totally different. But let's say that you picked up a male brain and a female brain and you compared them, and then you wanted to assess the likelihood that one would engage in criminal behavior over the other. Well, that is what we're going to talk about today and some of the research that is out there on the sex differences in brain processes. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. All right, so let's talk about sex differences in brain processes. We know that criminologists have long debated whether the risk factors for criminal behavior differ for males and females, but what we've come to know is that gender is the single best predictor of criminal behavior. We know that men commit more crime and women commit less crime. This distinction holds throughout history for all societies, for all groups, and for nearly every crime category. And this finding is quite remarkable. So it really brings us to the question, wouldn't there have to be something fundamentally different between females and males? So today, we will be talking about biological sex, not gender. Almost all of the studies that have looked at brain anatomy have been done with people whose gender identity aligns with the sex that they were actually assigned at birth, which means we can't really apply these results to people with different gender identities. And same for people who are intersex, meaning that their chromosomes or reproductive anatomy don't fit the typical binary. With that in mind, we can ask whether there are fundamental differences in brain anatomy between biosex males and females. So this takes us to our important question. If we put a male and a female brain side by side, would we be able to see any differences? Well, the answer is not as straightforward, it's quite controversial, but a 2018 study, which is perhaps the most comprehensive study that we have to date, looked at the brains of 2,750 females and then 2,466 males, and found that anatomical differences did exist and were statistically significant. On average, females had thicker cortices in 48 of the 68 brain regions examined, but males had larger brains and larger brain regions and structures. So when they were looking at the brain, and when the size of the brain was accounted for in this study, the sex differences and the size of most of these regions disappeared. So due to size differences in structures like the hippocampus, the caudate nucleus, and the thalamus, which have been up for debate across the years. And females actually ended up having larger relative volumes for 10 regions, as well as the right nucleus accumbens. But the difference in size of these structures, absolute or relative, were quite small, and there was a lot of overlap between the genders. So despite all this controversy, there might be some small differences on average between males and females. And this, of course, makes sense, given that males and females are going to have different chromosomes and they're going to be exposed to different set of hormones, both prenatally and throughout their entire lives. So as we've noted, the brain is famous for being plastic after all, going back to our lecture from yesterday talking about plasticity. And it makes sense that how you were raised and treated and how you act alters your brain as well. So looking in this biology and environment overlap. So it's important to realize that sex differences come from both of these influences, and that is why it's important for us to look at both of these disciplines when we're trying to understand criminal behavior. So if you're interested in this any further, I would highly recommend picking up a book on biosocial criminology. All right, so let's talk about females and empathy, and then we'll talk about males and empathy as well. So a female's ability to exert empathy is a huge factor that keeps arising in literature that assesses the brain. and one's propensity towards deviant and criminal behavior. But first, we need to understand really what empathy is. And we are actually going to do that by watching a video by Brené Brown that I really, really enjoy. So let's go ahead and go to that.
A vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you,
go to the beginning. There we go.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right, I hope you guys enjoyed that video. It is definitely one of my favorites. So as the video notes, empathy is going to really fuel connection, but sympathy is going to drive disconnection. So for empathy, we really need to connect with something in ourselves to be able to relate to other individuals. And what we see is that females have a stronger disposition towards empathy than do males. And as you're reading notes for today, even studies that have tested subjects on observing facial expressions have shown that women do significantly better than men on actually interpreting the emotional expressions pictured. And a huge meta-analysis, which is ultimately a statistical procedure for combining data from multiple studies, was done, and it looked at empathy and antisocial behavior. And it found empathy to have strong inhibitory effects on crime. In other words, the ability to suppress or restrain an impulse. And so if you're interested in that, go ahead and take a look at your reading, and you can find that academic article as well. All right, but what we do find out is that when one's levels of empathy were accounted for, females were just as likely to commit criminal offenses. It was the high levels of empathy that appeared to account for significantly lower levels of criminal activity in women. Thus, both experts and the available empirical evidence points to a really strong link between lower levels of empathy and criminality, which are persistent between males and females. All right, but what happens when we look at males and empathy? Well, studies actually show us that males tend to be much more competitive and claim status significantly more than do females in virtually all species, including humans. So remember when you were in grade school, playgrounds probably had gendered turfs, with some areas and activities such as large playing fields and basketball courts being controlled mostly by the boys, and then other smaller enclaves like jungle gym areas and concrete spaces for hopscotch and jump rope, which were more often than not controlled by the girls. So boys have shown to establish dominant hierarchies and to maintain such systems throughout all forms of play, but females tend to engage in more cooperative and egalitarian play groups. Research also shows us that men are more assertive than girls, even at early ages of 13 to 24 months. This competitive aggressiveness is consistent throughout all ages. Studies have also shown us that men are likely to bond with one another, but only in the sense of forming alliances with fellow competitors. Such dynamics among males have also been found consistently throughout the animal kingdom, with males cooperating with each other only to the extent that it furthers their status and their well-being in a group. But let's ask the question, why do males challenge one another for status more than females? From an evolutionary standpoint, which you guys will read about in your books, males have much more to gain from competition for higher status than do females, although many sociologists will actually disagree with this proposition. Specifically, a female can't drastically spread her genes by gaining mating ability with numerous males. However, a male can monopolize or at least gain greater accessibility for the production of his genes if he has higher status in a specific group. Although this proposition is much more relevant when it comes to the animal kingdom, many evolutionary theorists have linked this tendency in males to humans as well. And they claim numerous eons of evolution still manifest in our modern society and the group dynamics that we see amongst males today. And so where does this take us? Let's transition back to criminology. So for those of you that have taken a criminology class, you've probably heard of low self-control theory by Gottfredson and Hershey, and how they tried to explain the differences in males versus females. And they ultimately apply some of these evolutionary adaptations that we talked about. The males are more likely to exhibit risk-taking, aggressive behaviors than our females because they are biologically disposed towards such tendencies, which they were required for survival. And we do see this being linked to some of the findings that we find in the brain literature as well. All right, so let's go ahead and bring this all together. Sex differences in emotional traits and dispositions are likely due to structural and functional differences in the brain. So we have to account for all of these. And as you'll read, structural differences in the brain occur early in the womb, and they're going to continue throughout the entire life. So higher or lower levels of male testosterone, as well as varying levels of female hormones such as estrogen, appear to have a profound effect on the cognitive functioning and the temperaments of girls and boys, as well as women and men. But also the varying levels and effects of self-conscious emotions, as well as other aspects of cognitive functioning between males and females, appear to be linked to physiological differences between these two sexes. And these differences are later influenced by very child-rearing practices and other forms of socialization that lead to gender role development internalized for boys and girls. So for instance, parents tend to verbally evaluate their young boys in global ways, such as you are a good boy when they succeed, where they tend to evaluate their girls actually in act-specific ways when they succeed, such as you did a good job. In contrast, parents tend to verbally evaluate their boys in act-specific ways. That was a really hard job when they don't succeed, whereas they tend to evaluate their young girls more globally when they don't succeed at a task. So differences that we see in brain functioning cause women to be more oriented towards social bonds and nurturing attitudes, and then men to be more disposed towards aggressiveness and risk seeking. All right, well, that is the lecture for today, and I hope you guys have an enjoyable time reading the chapter. It's a very good chapter, one of my favorites from this section. Please let me know if you have any questions, and then tomorrow you will have those videos to watch and no reading for tomorrow. All right, have a good one.